Only they thought I wouldn't fight back, that I'd stay quiet while they turned my land into a dumping ground, one rainfall at a time. But what happens when the man they tried to flood is a retired military engineer who knows exactly how to track every inch of soil, every drop of water, every lie they buried under gravel? Just a story about Runoff. This is about how a powerful HOA tried to crush one homeowner by secretly redirecting their stormwater until nature evidence, and one hell of a storm exposed the whole scheme. On their yards flooded, their basements drowned, and their board president screamed in the street when the water they sent to destroy me came pouring back into their million-dollar homes. This is the story of how I turned a trench war into a legal firestorm and brought a corrupt HOA to its knees without ever raising my voice. You're watching HOA board members' real stories, real justice, and the power of one person standing their ground. When I closed on the house at 1440 Sycamore Ridge in late March, I truly believed I was purchasing peace. After 26 years in the Army Corps of Engineers years, filled with choking sandstorms that stripped paint from vehicles, endless base politics that eroded trust faster than any desert wind, and far too many nights when incoming mortar rounds turned sleep into a luxury, I was done with chaos. All I wanted was a quiet cul-de-sac rich soil under my hands, and mornings where the only explosions were the sudden trills of cardinals in the hedges. The neighborhood looked perfect from the street rows of tidy brick homes with freshly painted shutters, hedges clipped into perfect green walls, children weaving figure eights on scooters, and retirees waving from porches as they coaxed prize roses into bloom. The realtor, a cheerful woman named Claire with a clipboard and an unbreakable smile, kept repeating the phrase, "Strong but fair HOA," as if it were the ultimate selling point. I nodded politely, signed the papers, and told myself that a little oversight was a small price to pay for order. I moved in on a cool, overcast Saturday. The air carried that unmistakable early spring bite, sharp enough to remind you winter hadn't fully surrendered yet, soft enough to turn soil without breaking your back. Those first weeks became a quiet ritual of reclamation. I built raised cedar beds along the back fence, laid out precise rows for heirloom tomatoes, and spent evenings hauling wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow of smooth river rock to armor the gentle rear slope. My lot sat a few feet lower than the surrounding properties, a natural low point in the cul-de-sac that the home inspector had flagged with mild caution monitor for occasional stormwater flow, but foundation and grading appear sound. I wasn't worried. I had read terrain the way other men read newspapers. I'd once designed and built a levee system in Kandahar with 48 hours notice, half a crew, and incoming fire for motivation. A suburban backyard slope felt like child's play. The first warning came so quietly, I almost dismissed it. It was early April, after a gentle overnight rain that left the air smelling of wet pine and promise. I stepped out back with my coffee and noticed a thin, dark ribbon of muddy water tracing the base of the rear fence. It wasn't much, just a shallow gleam catching the morning light, barely enough to soak the grass. I figured it was residual drainage from winter saturation, or perhaps a minor blockage in an old French drain. I made a mental note to check it the following weekend and went on with planting sugar snap peas, but the ribbon returned bolder each time. By mid-April, every shower brought a stronger flow. The water no longer hugged the fence line. It carved a deliberate path straight through my vegetable beds. Young kale leaves floated like tiny green boats. The thick layer of hardwood mulch I'd spread so carefully turned into a sodden mat that slid downhill in slow, deliberate clumps. My carefully leveled river rock terraces began to sag under the relentless pressure. This wasn't natural seepage from the hillside. This was volume concentrated, directed, and growing. At first, I refused to believe the worst. Maybe the neighborhood's drainage patterns had shifted after a heavy winter. Maybe underground pipes installed decades ago were finally failing. I needed facts. One cool evening, I pulled my old laser level from the garage, the same one I'd carried through multiple deployments, and set it up on a tripod. I shot lines across the yard, ran bright orange string from stake to stake, and mapped every inch of elevation change under the fading light. The data told a story my gut already suspected. Behind the split-rail fence on the HOA-owned common area uphill from my property, a 4-inch PVC pipe had been freshly buried. its open end pointed like an accusing finger directly at my backyard. The surrounding soil was raw and dark, still loose from recent disturbance. Patches of grass seed struggled to take hold where heavy boots had trodden. That pipe had not been there during any of my pre-purchase walkthroughs. Someone had installed it after I moved in, routing stormwater straight onto my land, without a word, without permission, without even the courtesy of a knock on my door. I stood there in the gathering dusk, the laser level still humming faintly beside me, and felt the old battlefield chill settle in my chest. Not fear, something colder, more familiar. The quiet, coiled recognition that a fight had already begun, whether I wanted it or not. They had turned my dream of peace into their convenient spillway, and they hadn't even bothered to ask. The very next morning, with the image of that accusing PVC pipe still burned into my mind, I drove the short loop to the HOA office. A squat, beige building that had once been the neighborhood pool house, now repurposed with frosted glass doors and a brass plaque that read Sycamore Ridge Homeowners Association. Inside, the air was cool and faintly chemical smelling of chlorine ghosts and fresh printer ink. A single receptionist sat behind a high counter, her monitor glowing with spreadsheets. I introduced myself, politely explained that I had a maintenance concern involving stormwater drainage, and asked if I could speak to whoever oversaw landscaping and grounds. The woman Brittany, according to her nameplate, finally looked up. Her expression was practiced neutrality, the kind perfected by years of fielding complaints without ever solving them. Without a word, she reached into an acrylic holder, selected a crisp business card, and slid it across the counter like a poker dealer. Kenneth J. Albright, HOA President. A phone number, an email, and beneath it, in smaller font, appointments required. Mr. Albright doesn't take walk-ins, she said, already turning back to her screen. You can email him. I thanked her, pocketed the card, and left. The door hissed shut behind me with a finality that felt almost deliberate. That afternoon, back in my kitchen, with a fresh cup of coffee cooling beside me, I drafted the email with the same precision I once used for after-action reports. I attached a dozen time-stamped photographs, close-ups, of the raw earth around the pipe, wide shots, showing the muddy scars already cutting through my raised beds, even a short video clip of water pouring from the pipe's mouth after a brief morning sprinkle. I included a hand-drawn schematic of the flow direction, complete with elevation measurements from my laser level. My language stayed measured and professional. I described the progressive damage to my garden, the risk to my slope stability, and then offered solutions. A shared French drain along the boundary, a reroute back to the community retention pond. I even volunteered to split the cost of a third-party engineer if it would resolve the issue quickly and fairly. I read it twice, attached everything, and hit send. Then I waited. Days slid past. No red receipt. No automated reply. No acknowledgement at all. The silence felt deliberate, like a superior officer ignoring a field report he didn't want to deal with. A week later, on a gray afternoon thick with the promise of more rain, I walked out back to check the erosion markers I'd started placing. From the uphill common area came the low rumble of an engine and the rhythmic scrape of shovels. Two landscapers in familiar green shirts uniforms I now recognized as the HOA's regular contractor were working along the fence line. One operated a small skid steer, the other raked fresh gravel by hand. By the time I reached the boundary, the exposed end of the PVC pipe had disappeared completely. In its place stretched a shallow, elegantly contoured swale lined with river rock and bordered by clumps of ornamental grasses. From the street or from any casual glance, it looked like a thoughtful landscape upgrade, the kind that wins Yard of the Month. But I knew the slope intimately now. The subtle downward pitch remained expertly disguised beneath decorative stone. The new design spread the flow wider more efficiently, turning what had been a single stream into a sheet of water that soaked even more of my yard. I stood at the fence hands, gripping the top rail until the metal bit into my palms, and felt something cold and hard settle in my gut. This wasn't incompetence. This wasn't an honest mistake corrected. They had seen my email, my photographs, my measurements, my reasonable offers, and instead of responding, they had chosen to bury the evidence deeper and make the diversion more effective. That evening, as the predicted rain began to fall in a steady whisper against the windows, I watched from my darkened kitchen. Thin silver threads of water emerged from beneath the fresh gravel gathered speed as they crossed the property line and resumed their quiet invasion of my land. The disguised channel worked flawlessly now, spreading saturation then farther and faster than before. I closed the blinds slowly, the sound of rain on the roof suddenly louder, more insistent. The old instincts stirred, the ones that had kept me alive through long nights when command refused to listen. Anger alone was useless. It had to be channeled, shaped, aimed. If polite cooperation and documented evidence weren't going to move them, then I would escalate slowly, methodically, and with the relentless patience the Army had hammered into me over decades. They thought they could hide their actions behind gravel and grass. I would make sure the truth surfaced in ways they could no longer bury. I didn't rush into confrontation. I'd learned long ago that charging uphill without reconnaissance was a good way to get cut down. Instead, I gave them one more chance to do the right thing. For the next 10 days, I kept photographing every rainfall, time-stamped images of the disguised channel doing its dirty work, videos of water sheeting across my yard in glossy, relentless waves. The damage was accelerating. Entire sections of mulch washed away, river rock scattered like shrapnel, the careful terraces I'd built sagging into muddy scars. My tomatoes, only weeks from bearing fruit, leaned drunkenly as their roots lost purchase. Still no reply from Kenneth Albright. So I did what any reasonable homeowner would do. I attended the next HOA board meeting. It was the second Tuesday in May, 6:00 p.m., sharp, in the community clubhouse that smelled of lemon polish and stale donuts. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, facing a long table draped in navy cloth. About 30 residents had shown up, mostly retirees in golf shirts, and mothers juggling toddlers on their hips, sipping lukewarm coffee from white styrofoam cups. I took a seat near the back, tablet in hand, feeling the familiar pre-mission calm settle over me. The agenda was the usual suburban theater pool hours, landscaping bids, complaints about teenagers parking on the street. When the president finally opened the floor for public comment, I raised my hand. Kenneth J. Albright called my name with the weary indulgence of a man used to being obeyed. He was mid-60s, tanned and trim polo shirt, tucked crisply into pressed khakis, silver hair combed with military precision. He had the posture of someone who believed volume and confidence were the same thing. I walked to the front, plugged my tablet into their projector, and began. I showed the before and after photos, the raw PVC pipe, then the same spot camouflaged under decorative gravel. I displayed my laser-level measurements, proving the flow had been artificially steepened. I projected the city's original subdivision drainage plan, downloaded from public records, showing stormwater was supposed to be routed through a concrete channel that had mysteriously disappeared during a beautification project 5 years earlier. I spoke calmly, factually, the way I once briefed colonels under canvas tents, while mortars walked the ridgeline. Kenneth leaned back, arms folded across his chest, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When I finished, the room was quiet enough to hear the air conditioning hum. Then he spoke. "Mr. Shaw," he began, voice syrupy with forced patience, "our maintenance team simply restored a pre-existing natural drainage path. No one is trying to flood your property. Sometimes new homeowners misunderstand how water moves on a slope." A ripple of soft laughter ran along the board table. A woman with sharp red lipstick and a clipboard, Vice President Susan Delaney, I later learned, leaned toward the microphone and added, "Sounds like someone's just upset their little garden got a bit muddy." More laughter, louder this time. A few heads in the audience turned to look at me with pitying smiles, as if I were the eccentric newcomer who didn't understand how things worked around here. I felt it then, the slow white-hot surge I hadn't experienced since a certain lieutenant colonel dismissed my warning about an unstable bridge in Helmand Province right before it collapsed under a supply convoy. That same sickening mix of fury and clarity. The realization that facts offered politely were being swatted away like gnats because they inconvenienced people in power. I stood there a moment longer, letting the laughter die into awkward coughs. I could have argued, could have raised my voice, demanded respect. Instead, I unplugged my tablet, looked Kenneth Albright dead in the eye, and said nothing at all. I walked out while they were still shuffling papers. Outside, the spring air had cooled. The sky was the deep indigo that comes just before full dark. I stood on the clubhouse steps, breathing it in, feeling the knot in my chest tighten into something hard and useful. This wasn't about a garden anymore. This was about a group of people who believed rules applied only to others, who thought they could redirect nature itself to avoid minor inconvenience and petty expense. They had laughed at me in public. They had lied to my face. And in doing so, they had made the oldest mistake in any conflict. They underestimated the man they were fighting. I drove home slowly, windows down, letting the night air scour the clubhouse stench from my clothes. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the decision was made not in anger, but with the cold certainty I'd felt the night before a long patrol. This was no longer a neighborly disagreement. This was war. Quiet, methodical, relentless. And I had fought and won far worse wars than this. The days after that humiliating board meeting blurred into a focused, almost meditative routine, one I knew well from years of preparing for operations where the stakes were life and death. Anger had sharpened into purpose. I no longer fumed, I planned. Every rainfall became an opportunity. I was out in it, boots, sinking into the mud, rain slicking my hair, placing bright orange survey flags to mark the advancing edge of erosion, driving painted stakes into the soil to track how far the deluge spread overnight. I photographed everything: standing pools, reflecting the gray sky near my foundation rivulets, carving fresh gullies through what had been pristine beds. My rain barrel toppled like a fallen soldier by a surge that had no business being there. I logged dates, times, rainfall amounts from the weather app, and estimated flow rates with a simple bucket and stopwatch method I'd improvised from field engineering tricks. The garden I had poured my retirement dreams into was dying inch by inch, and I documented every casualty with the cold precision of a battlefield medic recording wounds. When I wasn't outside, I was inside, laptop, open coffee going cold beside me, digging through public records. I drove downtown to the county clerk's office twice in 1 week, spending hours in a fluorescent-lit room that smelled of old paper and copier toner. I requested plat maps, original subdivision engineering drawings, stormwater easement filings, permits for any drainage work in the past decade. The clerk, a weary woman named Gloria, who had clearly seen every flavor of neighborhood crusader, eventually took pity on me and showed me how to navigate the online portal from home. What I uncovered wasn't just negligence. It was calculated avoidance. The original 1998 subdivision plans, signed and sealed by a now-retired engineering firm, clearly showed a concrete swale along the eastern edge of Sycamore Ridge that was meant to carry all stormwater into a retention basin at the low end of the development. That basin had been removed in 2019 during what the HOA minutes euphemistically called a beautification and green space enhancement project. No replacement system had ever been built. No new permits filed. Instead, over the years, various landscaping improvements had quietly nudged water toward the lowest lots, mine being the lowest of all. There was no recorded easement allowing the HOA to route stormwater across private property. None. Not even a vague utility corridor. My lot was supposed to receive only what naturally sheet flowed from my own roof and driveway. Everything else was someone else's responsibility. I printed it all, hundreds of pages, highlighting key sections in yellow, binding them into folders labeled by year and category. I created digital backups on 2 separate drives. Old habits. One Saturday morning, I followed the disguised channel uphill, myself carefully peeling back a section of the decorative gravel with a garden trowel. Beneath the pretty rocks lay perforated flex pipe, exactly like a French drain, angled to collect water from the upper lots and spit it out through a hidden outlet in the split rail fence directly above my yard. The workmanship was professional, deliberate, and completely unpermitted. I took core soil samples with an auger I'd bought online, twisting it deep into the slope until I hit saturated clay more than 14 inches down. The readings from a cheap moisture meter I buried confirmed what I already felt in my bones. The ground under my foundation was turning into a sponge. Left unchecked, settlement cracks would appear. Then structural issues, then thousands, maybe tens of thousands in repairs. And still not a word from the HOA. Not a site visit, not an apology, nothing. I sent 2 more certified letters, one to Kenneth Albright, one to the entire board, repeating my offer to meet to split costs on a proper fix to avoid escalation. I included updated photos showing the worsening erosion. Return receipts came back signed, but no response arrived. Instead, one morning, I watched from my kitchen window as the same two landscapers returned. This time they brought rebar and bags of quick-set concrete. They were reinforcing the hillside, one of them told me when I walked up and asked. But the angle of their new trench, steeper wider, told the real story. They were doubling down, preparing to handle even more water at my expense. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the back deck in the dark, listening to crickets and the faint gurgle of underground flow. Memories surfaced, unbidden nights in forward operating bases, tracing leaks through kilometers of pipe while tracers arced overhead. Briefings ignored because fixing the problem would inconvenience someone higher up the chain. I was done asking nicely. The next day, I packaged everything: photos, videos, plats, soil logs, the highlighted code violations, and mailed certified copies to the city's Public Works Department, the Environmental Enforcement Division, and for good measure, the HOA's retained attorney, Dennis J. Finkelman. I kept the originals. Then I opened the weathered green footlocker I hadn't touched since leaving the Army. Inside, under folded flags and old deployment notebooks, lay a clean page waiting. I wrote in block letters across the top: Operation Drain Lock, objective, restore lawful drainage, hold the line, make them pay for every inch they took. I underlined it twice. The war had gone from cold to active, and this time I had all the time in the world. The first real counterstrike came in late May, after a moderate thunderstorm that left my backyard looking like a battlefield after artillery prep deep gouges where water had ripped through the soil, raised beds, tilted at crazy angles, my shed listing slightly as the ground beneath it softened. I woke to the sound of gurgling outside my window, stepped onto the deck in bare feet, and felt the earth squish coldly between my toes. The yard had begun to liquefy. That was the morning I stopped defending and started fortifying. I drove to a quarry 20 miles away and loaded my truck with limestone boulders, rough, heavy blocks the color of storm clouds. Over the next 3 weekends, I built a low retaining wall along the base of the slope entirely on my own property, never crossing the boundary by so much as an inch. The wall stood just under 36 inches high, deliberately below the height that required HOA approval, and was faced with stone that matched my house's exterior. From the street, it looked like thoughtful hardscaping. From my side, it was a dam. Its real purpose, if the diverted cascade ever came again in force, the water would hit the wall and rebound uphill back toward the source. I laid every stone myself, muscles burning, in a way that felt honest and clean after months of bureaucratic frustration. Each boulder was another promise kept to the land I'd chosen to protect. Brittany showed up on the final Saturday, standing on the sidewalk in her HOA windbreaker, arms crossed. She didn't step onto my property, smart enough to know better, but called out over the fence. "That wall is going to need board review and approval, Mr. Shaw." I didn't stop working. I heaved another stone into place, tamped it down with the back of a shovel, and answered without looking up. "It's 35 inches high. Your own architectural guidelines say anything under 3 feet is exempt. Check page 14 of the manual you people love quoting." She hesitated, lips tightening, then turned and walked away without another word. 2 days later, the retaliation arrived in my mailbox, an official violation notice on heavy cream stock stamped with the Sycamore Ridge HOA seal. It claimed my unauthorized stone barrier constituted a non-compliant landscaping feature that could pose a safety hazard and alter natural drainage patterns. I had 10 days to remove it or face daily fines starting at $50 and escalating from there. I read it twice in the driveway, the paper trembling slightly in the breeze. Not from fear, from the slow, icy recognition that they had just escalated from passive aggression to open warfare. They were trying to bury me in paperwork and penalties because I'd dared to protect what was mine. That evening, I carried the letter inside, laid it on the kitchen table next to my growing stack of evidence, and opened the footlocker again. Inside, beneath faded unit patches and a folded flag, lay the green field notebook I'd carried through every deployment. Its pages were filled with sketches of bridge designs drawn under flashlight coordinates, scribbled during sandstorms, names of soldiers I'd never forget. I turned to the first blank page and wrote in careful block letters, "Operation Drainlock, Phase 1 document, and contain Phase 2. Counterattack, objective, restore lawful drainage. Hold the line. Force accountability. Then I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in almost 10 years. Colonel Mark Reeves Rhett answered on the third ring, his voice gravelly but warm. We traded the usual retired soldier pleasantries. Bad knees, grandkids, the way time compresses after you leave the fight. Then I told him what I was dealing with: an HOA illegally rerouting stormwater onto my property, concealing it, ignoring complaints, and now fining me for protecting my own land. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long pause and then a low whistle. Send me everything you've got, Mike. Photos, plats, correspondence, soil logs, the works. I scanned and emailed it all that night. 2 days later, his report came back 4 pages of professional letterhead, complete with code citations, engineering diagrams, and a conclusion in bold. The actions of the Sycamore Ridge HOA constitute clear violation of county stormwater management ordinances and private property rights. The unpermitted diversion poses ongoing risk of erosion and structural damage to downstream properties. I printed 3 copies, bound them neatly, and added them to the arsenal. Then I took Jolene's advice, the code enforcement officer I'd spoken to briefly at Public Works, and scheduled a formal appointment. But I knew the wheels of civilian bureaucracy turned slowly. While I waited, I needed to keep the ground from washing away entirely. So I reinforced the wall with hidden steel pins, backfilled with compacted gravel for better drainage control, and seeded the face with deep-rooted native grasses. Every improvement was legal documented and entirely within my boundaries. The second violation notice arrived a week later for excessive rock placement this time. I filed it carefully with the first. They wanted to play the game of fines and threats. Fine. I had spent decades learning how to fight battles where the enemy held every advantage on paper. This time I was writing the rules, and I wasn't backing down an inch. Colonel Reeves's report landed like the first solid artillery round in a long barrage, precise, authoritative, and impossible to ignore. With it in hand, I walked straight into the City of Hawthorne's Public Works building the following Monday morning. The lobby smelled of industrial cleaner and wet concrete. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I waited my turn at the counter. Jolene Ramirez, the environmental code officer I'd spoken to briefly on the phone, met me in a small conference room. She was mid-40s, no-nonsense, haircut, steel-rimmed glasses that caught the light when she leaned forward. I spread everything across the table: Reeves's engineering assessment, my folders of photos and videos, soil moisture logs graphed in neat lines, the plat maps, with the missing retention basin circled in red. She flipped through the pages without comment at first, only the occasional soft escaping as she paused on particularly damning images. The hidden flex pipe, the raw erosion scars, the disguised gravel swale now functioning as an illegal conduit. When she finished, she sat back and looked at me squarely. You've built a very strong case, Mr. Shaw. If this diversion is on HOA common area and lacks any permit or easement, it's a clear violation of municipal stormwater code. We'll open an official file today. Relief washed over me, cool and unexpected. For the first time since discovering the pipe, someone in authority was listening. But Jolene tempered it quickly. These things move slowly. We'll schedule a site inspection, notify the HOA. Give them time to respond. Could be weeks before we get boots on the ground. I nodded. I knew the rhythm of bureaucracy better than most. Weeks was fine. I had already shifted to the long game. While the city gears began to turn, I turned my backyard into a surveillance grid. I ordered equipment I hadn't touched since a contract job in Nevada years earlier: waterproof ground moisture probes, a flow velocity sensor, low-light trail cameras with infrared, even a couple of surplus seismic monitors that doubled as movement detectors. Over 3 careful nights working under the cover of darkness and the hum of spring peepers, I laid sensor wire along the rear third of my property, burying it shallow enough to retrieve later, but deep enough to survive mowing. By the end of the week, I had a dashboard on my laptop, real-time graphs of soil saturation time-lapse footage from 3 angles, motion alerts sent straight to my phone. If the HOA contractor so much as sneezed on that slope, I would know. The first real test came 4 nights later. A steady Pacific spring rain moved in after midnight. Nothing apocalyptic, just the persistent drumming that usually freshens the air and settles dust. But my phone buzzed at 1:17 a.m. with a motion alert. I opened the live feed and watched, heart-pounding, slow and steady, as clear, deliberate torrents emerged from the ornamental rock garden uphill. The water didn't meander downhill naturally. It channeled through the man-made gravel trough lined with hidden mesh exiting discreet outlet ports camouflaged by decorative stone. The flow velocity spiked to 5.4 feet per second, enough to scour soil and move small rocks, exactly as Reeves had warned. I let the cameras roll for hours, capturing every minute as the cascade widened my erosion gullies and pooled against the foundation of my shed. Morning light revealed the damage in harsh detail, but I felt something close to satisfaction. The data was pristine, undeniable. I compiled it all into a new master file I named DrainGate. 37 time-stamped photos, 4 drone stills captured by a neighbor kid with a DJI and a personal grudge against the HOA. 3 days of continuous moisture logs, overlaid legal maps showing property lines and the exact location of the illicit conduit. Even thermal images from a borrowed FLIR camera showing concentrated heat loss where water surged underground. I printed 3 perfect bound copies on my home printer until the ink cartridges begged for mercy. Then I mailed them, certified one to City Public Works, one to the County Environmental Enforcement Division, and one directly to Dennis J. Finkelman, the HOA's attorney. Return receipts came back within days, each one signed in different handwriting. They knew I was coming. While I waited for the city's next move, I kept fortifying. The limestone wall held firm, but I added a subtle overflow lip angled to guide rebound water back through the narrow gaps in the split-rail fence, entirely legal, entirely on my side of the line. I seeded the berm with deep-rooted clover and fescue that would knit the soil together like living rebar. Brittany drove by twice that week, slowing her white HOA golf cart to stare. She never stopped. She didn't need to. The message was clear. I wasn't asking permission anymore. I was drawing the line they had tried to erase. And for the first time in months, when I stood on my back deck at dusk and listened to the evening settle, the ground beneath my feet felt solid again. Not fixed, not yet, but no longer slipping away. The sensors blinked their quiet green lights along the slope, watching, recording, waiting. So was I. The discovery that turned simmering resentment into cold fury came on a quiet Thursday evening, buried in a stack of public records I'd requested through a FOIA submission to the city. I'd asked for any correspondence between the HOA and Public Works over the past 18 months, emails, memos, invoices, anything. The response arrived in a thick red folder, 117 pages of bureaucratic back and forth about pool permits, streetlight repairs, and holiday decoration budgets. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and settled in at the kitchen table, flipping page by page under the warm glow of the pendant light. Most of it was mundane. But near the back, clipped to a contractor invoice for erosion control enhancements, was an email chain that stopped me cold. From Kenneth J. Albright, to Greenscape Landscaping, date April 18th, 3 days after my first email complaint. Subject: expedited work order. Hillside stabilization. Please expedite the erosion control channel near Lot 12. Homeowner is becoming vocal. Ensure work appears as routine landscaping maintenance. Invoice as general hillside reinforcement to avoid specific line items. Attached a rough sketch of the disguised gravel swale. I read it 3 times, the words searing themselves into my mind. Lot 12 was me, becoming vocal. They weren't just ignoring me, they were actively accelerating the damage because I'd dared to speak up. I sat back, coffee forgotten, feeling the old battlefield rage rise slow and steady. The kind that comes when you realize the enemy isn't careless. They're calculating. They had seen my evidence, weighed the minor cost of fixing the problem properly, and decided it was cheaper to silence one homeowner than to do the right thing for the community. I printed the email chain in color, highlighted the key sentences in blazing yellow, and added it to the master file. DrainGate now had a smoking gun. The very next morning, as if to underline their arrogance, a 3rd violation notice appeared in my mailbox, this time for unauthorized stonework that may pose a risk to neighborhood safety. The boulder wall I'd built entirely on my own land, well under height limits, was suddenly a potential hazard, requiring removal within 14 days. I laughed out loud in the driveway, a short, sharp bark that startled a neighbor walking her dog. They were doubling down on retaliation, even as the city's inspection loomed. Let them. Every threat, every fine, every lie was just more ammunition. Jolene called a few days later, her voice tighter than before. Mr. Shaw, we've reviewed your latest submission, including the email correspondence. This moves things from possible oversight to potential intentional violation. We're scheduling a full site visit next week with a county hydrologist and a representative from Environmental Protection. You'll want to be present. I'll be here, I said. Coffee will be hot, blueprints ready, and I've got a drone operator on standby. She paused. You mentioned the concealed conduit is still active, still dumping water every time it rains. I can show you live footage. Good, bring everything. I hung up feeling the first real surge of momentum. The net was closing, but the HOA wasn't finished pushing. That Friday evening, I was on the back deck nursing a glass of bourbon, watching fireflies blink against the darkening slope, when my phone pinged with a motion alert. I opened the camera feed and felt ice slide down my spine. Two figures in greenscape uniforms were working by headlamp along the common area fence line, redigging sections of the gravel swale, widening the outlet, adding fresh, perforated pipe. One glanced nervously toward my yard, as if sensing eyes on him. They weren't scaling back. They were reinforcing for the next big rain. I let the cameras roll, capturing every minute of the unauthorized nighttime work. Then I clipped the footage, timestamped it, and added it to a new folder, Unauthorized Activity. Post-legal warning. The forecast for the following week showed a major storm front moving in from the Pacific, heavy sustained rain, the kind that tests every system and exposes every weakness. I checked my wall one last time, boulder seated firm, overflow, lip angled perfectly, sensors blinking green. Let it come. I'd spent months preparing the battlefield. Now nature herself was about to deliver the decisive blow. And when the deluge hit, the water would finally go exactly where it was always meant to, back to the people who had tried to send it my way. They had built their empire on convenience and control. Soon they would learn what happens when you anger the wrong man and then turn your back on the storm. The storm arrived just after midnight, rolling in from the Pacific like a slow-moving artillery barrage. First came the wind-sharp gusts that rattled the windows and bent the trees along Sycamore Ridge Drive into bowing silhouettes. Then the thunder, deep and rolling, not the sharp cracks of summer lightning, but a low, continuous growl that vibrated through the foundation of the house. I stood at the living room window in the dark, coffee in hand, watching the first fat drops hit the glass and streak downward like tracer rounds. I had been waiting for this one. The forecast had called for sustained heavy rain, 2 to 3 inches overnight, maybe more, in localized bands. The kind of event that overwhelmed makeshift systems and revealed every hidden flaw. My sensors began pinging at 12:47 a.m. Ground saturation climbing, fast flow velocity spiking, as the illicit conduit uphill did exactly what it was designed to do, funnel every drop toward my lot. But tonight, the battlefield had changed. At 2:15 a.m., the deluge intensified into a roaring curtain of water. Streetlights turned the rain into silver sheets. I opened the laptop on the kitchen counter and watched the live feeds. The torrent slammed into my limestone berm with a force I could almost feel through the screen-white froth, exploding upward before cascading back through the narrow gaps in the split-rail fence. There was no engineered outlet on the HOA side anymore, no retention basin, no proper swale, just overgrown grass and poor grading. Gravity took over from there. By 3:06 a.m., the first yards uphill began to flood. My drone camera launched earlier and, hovering low under the eaves to avoid the worst wind, captured it in ghostly infrared water, spreading across manicured lawns, like spilled ink, pooling around foundation vents, seeping under garage doors. At 4:12 a.m., the cul-de-sac itself turned into a shallow lake. Storm drains clogged with years of accumulated mulch and debris from the removed retention basin gurgled uselessly. Water rose over curbs, lapped at driveway aprons, and began inching up toward front doors. I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. I just watched the way you watch incoming fire finally land on the right grid square after months of calling corrections. By sunrise, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. Lawns had become muddy lagoons. Cars sat half-submerged alarms, bleeding weakly until batteries died. Hanging baskets floated like wreckage. The peach-colored colonial where Susan Delaney lived, pristine white trim, perfect window boxes, now had water halfway up the porch steps, her prized ferns bobbing forlornly on the surface. And then the screaming started. It began with a single raised voice, echoing down the street distorted by wind and water. My exterior microphone picked it up faintly. Kenneth Albright, barefoot, in soaked khakis, standing ankle-deep in the middle of Sycamore Ridge Drive. He was shouting into his phone, arms flailing face purple, even in the gray light. "Where are the pumps? Somebody get the goddamn pumps." There were no pumps. There was no contingency plan. They had spent years engineering a fragile illusion of control, pretty gravel channels, veiled threats, violation letters, and assumed it would hold forever. Now the illusion had shattered, and they were drowning in the consequences. Fire trucks arrived around 7:15 a.m. Red lights strobing through the haze. Crews in yellow turnout gear waded through knee-deep water, assessing, prioritizing. One helped a wheelchair-bound resident from the lowest house on the east side. Another consoled a woman sweeping floodwater out of her kitchen with a push broom, tears cutting clean tracks down her soot-streaked face. City inspectors followed at 800's 3 vehicles, white with orange municipal stripes. I recognized Jolene immediately, yellow safety vest, clipboard wrapped in plastic against the drizzle eyes, scanning the chaos with professional calm. She traced the flow backward with her gaze, up the slope past the exposed pipe outlets, now spitting water freely to the source on the common area. Then she looked across at my house. My yard was wet. Certainly rain is rain, but the soil held. The berm stood firm, grass already greening along its face. No standing pools, no erosion scars. My foundation dry. My garden battered but intact. I stood on the back porch in boots and rain jacket, arms folded, and gave her a single nod. She nodded back. No one from the HOA came to my door that morning. No Kenneth, no Brittany, no frantic board members demanding I fix what I had broken. They were too busy bailing out their own homes, literally. Pumps whined up and down the street. Shop vacuums hummed. Neighbors hauled ruined furniture to the curb in stunned silence. They couldn't blame me anymore. Not with the cameras rolling. Not with the sensors logging every second. Not with the reports already filed and the inspectors walking the site. I had broken no law. I had trespassed on no property. I had vandalized nothing. I had simply protected what was mine and allowed nature to return the favor. As the rain tapered to a steady drizzle and the sun finally broke through in pale watery light, I stepped into the garden. The air smelled clean wet earth ozone, the faint metallic tang of storm. My tomatoes drooped but stood. The kale leaves glistened resilient. I turned on the hose and began gently rinsing mud from the limestone boulders. Let them scream. Let them scramble. Let them wade through the swamp they had created. My ground was solid, and the current was finally flowing the right direction. By noon that day, Sycamore Ridge looked like a war zone after the ceasefire sun high, and merciless, shining on every warped fence post, every sodden carpet dragged to the curb, every ruined flower bed turned to black soup. Water still shimmered in low spots like cruel mirrors, reflecting the stunned faces of people who had woken up in a postcard neighborhood and gone to bed in a disaster area. The HOA board was in full meltdown. Kenneth Albright paced the middle of the cul-de-sac in the same soaked khakis, phone pressed to his ear, barking at contractors who weren't answering. Susan Delaney stood on her porch steps in rubber boots, staring at the dark water line that had climbed halfway up her front door, her hands shaking so hard the hanging fern she tried to rescue slipped from her fingers and floated away. Then the city trucks arrived. 2 white public works vehicles, 1 black county SUV, and Jolene's car pulling up last. Out stepped Marcus Greer, Senior Environmental Compliance Officer, tall, calm, the kind of man who never raises his voice because he never needs to. Beside him, Diane Cruz, civil hydrologist from the Department of Environmental Protection, already carrying a thick binder and wearing a high-visibility vest that said she had seen worse than this. They walked straight to my porch. I was waiting with a thumb drive in my shirt pocket, 3 bound copies of the final dossier, and coffee poured into travel mugs. Mr. Shaw, Greer said, shaking my hand firmly. Let's start at the source. We walked the slope together. The gravel swale had been torn open by the storm pipes, exposed like broken veins, water still trickling from the outlets they had widened the night before. Diane crouched, dropped a weighted probe into the channel, measured the slope with a digital clinometer, and shook her head. No inlet filter, no silt trap, no energy dissipation. This is not maintenance. This is an engineered diversion, without permits, without easements, and without regard for downstream property rights. Greer turned to me. You said they never applied for any drainage modification. Checked every office myself. Nothing filed since 2018, and that was just a mailbox permit. Jolene stepped forward, GoPro camera rolling on her chest. We pulled their alteration requests again last night. 0 matches. This was covert from day one. I handed them the thumb drive. Everything is on here, every timestamp, every velocity reading, every email, including the one where Kenneth told the contractor to expedite the channel near Lot 12 because the homeowner is becoming vocal. Marcus's jaw tightened. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We crossed the street. 5 homes had taken the worst of it. Rachel, the neighbor who once defended the HOA during a mailbox height debate, stood on her lawn with her arms folded, lips pressed into a thin line. Water had reached her crawl space vents. She looked at me, then at the inspectors, and said quietly, Mike tried to warn them 3 times. They fined him instead. The inspectors took soil samples marked off flooded zones, with red flags photographed every angle. I stayed back, letting the evidence speak. At noon, back on my porch, Marcus flipped to the last page of his notepad. We're submitting a formal report to both city and county planning boards today. The HOA will face multiple citations, illegal stormwater redirection, failure to maintain required infrastructure, violation of private property rights, and probable environmental negligence. Fines will start immediately and accrue daily until remediation is complete. Diane added, if the damage is as severe as it looks, you may be entitled to full restitution for repairs to your property. Jolene looked at me directly. You did everything right, Mike. You documented. You tried mediation. You stayed legal. If more people handled problems like you did, we'd have a lot fewer disasters. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. That afternoon, I scanned the audit summary and emailed it to Laura Sims, the environmental lawyer Tom and Lydia had recommended. She called within 40 minutes. This is gold, Mike. Negligence, retaliation, documented damages, and now an official city finding. We'll start with a cease and desist letter to the HOA and a demand for immediate remediation. If they don't settle fast, we go for civil damages plus punitive. I looked out the window. The pump truck was finally winding its way down the street, sucking water out of basements. Neighbors were sweeping, crying, hugging each other. The blame had landed exactly where it belonged. Within the week, resignations began. Susan Delaney, first sudden family obligations. Brittany vanished from the clubhouse without a goodbye. Then Kenneth Albright himself sent a 1-paragraph email to the entire neighborhood. Due to unforeseen challenges, I am stepping down as president, effective immediately. The board will appoint interim leadership to guide us through this difficult period. Coward's exit. The interim president, Peter Cho, a quiet, gray-haired man who had never spoken at a meeting, showed up at my door the next Tuesday with an envelope in his hand and real regret in his eyes. Mike, the board asked me to deliver this personally. Inside a check for $10,000. A formal letter of apology on new letterhead. A promise to hire a licensed hydrologist to redesign the entire drainage system with full community input. I opened the envelope in front of him. The check felt heavier than it should have. Peter shifted. It's not enough to cover everything. We know that. But it's a start. And we're cooperating fully with the city now. We don't really have a choice. I looked at him for a long moment. No, I said. You don't. I accepted the check not because I needed it, but because it was the first time they had admitted guilt in writing. Laura reviewed it that night. Goodwill payment, not a full settlement. You can still pursue more if you want. But accepting this doesn't waive your rights. I looked out at the garden. The tomatoes were straightening again. The berm was already sprouting new grass. No, I told her. Let them keep their dignity. That's punishment enough. The city, however, had no such mercy. 3 weeks later, bulldozers arrived. They tore out the illegal pipes, filled the clandestine conduits, reshaped the entire common area slope into a proper drainage basin, complete with native plants, safety railings, and public signage. For the first time in months, the water had somewhere legal to go. And I finally slept through the night. Summer settled over Sycamore Ridge that year, like a long overdue exhale. After months of tension, inspections, resignations, and the constant low hum of conflict, the neighborhood finally grew quiet. Not the brittle silence of avoidance, but the genuine hush of healing. I woke most mornings to sunlight filtering through the leaves, the soft rustle of breeze in the hedges, and the bright chatter of cardinals reclaiming their territory. No more midnight sensor alerts. No more gurgling water undermining the foundation. Just peace, the kind I had come here searching for, earned now through persistence rather than blind trust. The new stormwater basin behind my lot shimmered under the sun, its edges softened by native cattails and deep-rooted grasses planted under the city's supervision. Water flowed where engineers intended, gently, predictably, away from homes. The illicit channels were gone, excavated, filled, erased as thoroughly as the old board's arrogance. In their place stood interpretive signs explaining erosion control and native plantings, a quiet public admission that mistakes had been made and corrected. The HOA itself had been reborn under community pressure. Bylaws were rewritten in open meetings with actual homeowners at the table instead of a closed circle of self-appointed guardians. I never joined the board. I had no taste for politics after seeing how poisonous it could become. But when they asked for input on the new Environmental Advisory Committee, I volunteered as a consultant. They listened. Real engineers were hired. Real permits were filed. Transparency replaced secrecy. My garden flourished with a fierceness that felt almost defiant. The tomatoes grew heavy in scarlet clusters hanging like medals. Kale leaves unfurled broader and darker than before, as if the soil itself remembered the threat and grew stronger in response. I rebuilt the raised beds, higher, richer interplanting with marigolds and basil whose scents rose warm in the afternoons. The limestone berm remained, now softened by moss and creeping time, a permanent scar that had become a feature rather than a wound. Mornings found me on the back deck with coffee, pruning shears in hand, touching each leaf as if to confirm it was still mine. The earth felt different under my boots, forgiving, resilient, no longer angry. It had held the line with me. One August morning, Peter Cho pulled up in his sedate gray sedan and climbed out carrying a small gift bag. He approached slowly, almost shyly. "Mike," he said, handing it over. "From the interim board, and from a lot of us personally." Inside was a bottle of small batch bourbon, 12 years aged, and a handwritten card signed by more neighbors than I expected. "For everything you endured, and for everything you made right, thank you." We stood there a moment in the driveway, two men who had never been friends, but now shared something deeper than friendship, the knowledge of what happens when good people finally refuse to look away. That weekend, the neighborhood held its first real block party in years. No agendas, no approval forms, just folding tables, under shade trees, grills, smoking kids running through sprinklers while music drifted from someone's Bluetooth speaker. I brought smoked jalapeno cornbread and a cooler of iced tea. At first, I lingered near the edge, content to watch. But people sought me out one by one quietly. The woman who had once rolled her eyes at my muddy garden complaint gave me a long, wordless hug. A father whose basement I'd indirectly saved clasped my shoulder and said, "You made it safer for my kids. Thank you." Jordan, the lanky teenager doing the school project on environmental design, ran up with a printed report in his hands, an A++ circled in red at the top, complete with photos of my berm and sensor layout. As dusk painted the sky in amber and rose, I walked to the top of the slope one last time. The air was thick with the smell of a charcoal and cut grass. Below me, lights winked on in windows up and down Sycamore Ridge Drive. Laughter rose and fell. No one glanced nervously at the sky anymore, afraid of the next rain. My house stood solid at the bottom of the hill, brick, warm in the fading light, garden glowing, foundation uncracked and true. I had come here for silence, after a lifetime of noise. I had found something better, justice. Not the loud, triumphant kind, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when powerful people tried to erase one man's rights, that man documented, waited, and held his ground until the ground itself fought back. Some roots deepen under pressure. Some walls do not fall. Some soldiers, long retired, still know exactly how to defend a piece of earth they have chosen to call home. And sometimes when the storm finally passes and the water finds its proper course, the garden blooms brighter than ever.